The Blackroot. Chapter 1. The Silence of the Sap. The town of Oakhaven didn't appear on digital maps, and the locals preferred it that way. It was a huddled collection of gray stone houses pressed against the jagged knees of the mountains, a place where the air felt thin and the people looked as though they were holding their breath. Elias Thorne had arrived in a dust-covered SUV, his back seat cluttered with thousands of dollars of Leica lenses and carbon fiber tripods. He was a man who lived by the logic of the lens, the firm belief that the world was a series of problems to be solved by light, aperture, and patience. He had spent his career capturing the unseen, but he had always seen it through glass. To Elias, nature was a museum. It was beautiful, yes, but it was passive. "You're looking for the Blackroot," the bartender had said the night before. It wasn't a question. The man, whose name tag read Caleb, was polishing a glass that was already spotlessly clean. He didn't look at Elias. He looked at the reflection of the woods in the dark window behind the bar. People like you always are. You think a high-resolution sensor can capture the essence of a place that hasn't had a soul in 1,000 years. "I'm just here for the light," Elias had replied with a practiced, arrogant smile. "I've heard the canopy creates a specific kind of bioluminescent diffusion at dusk. It's a rare atmospheric phenomenon." Caleb finally looked up. His eyes were the color of stagnant water. "It ain't atmosphere, son. It's the woods exhaling, and you don't want to be there when it takes its next breath." The salt line. The next morning, the trailhead was shrouded in a fog so thick it felt like wet wool against Elias's skin. At the very edge of the forest stood a line of crushed white stone. The salt line. It was a stark, artificial border that separated the dying grass of the valley from the aggressive, obsidian-colored soil of the Blackroot. An old man sat on a stump near the line. He was wrapping his hands in strips of leather, his fingers gnarled like the roots he lived amongst. His eyes were milky with cataracts, yet as Elias approached, the old man's head snapped toward him with the precision of a hawk. "The trees there don't grow toward the sun, traveler," the old man rasped. "The sun is a lie the world tells itself to feel safe. In the Blackroot, things grow toward the sound of a beating heart. They grow toward the heat of a secret. If you cross that white stone, you aren't just a visitor. You're an ingredient." Elias chuckled, a dry, hollow sound. He checked his GPS, a top-of-the-line satellite messenger. "I have a beacon, friend. If I'm not back by Sunday, a helicopter will be hovering over this ingredient before Monday morning." The old man didn't laugh. He just went back to wrapping his hands. "The birds don't fly over the Blackroot, boy. Even the sky knows better than to look down." Elias stepped over the salt line. The moment his boot hit the black soil, the temperature dropped 10 degrees. It wasn't a chill of the wind. It was as if the heat was being pulled directly out of his bones by the earth itself. The death of logic. For the first hour, Elias felt the familiar thrill of the hunt. The Blackroot was a photographer's fever dream. The trees were ancient, their trunks thick as grain silos, covered in a moss that didn't feel like plant matter. It felt like damp green fur. The bark was silver-gray and rippled with textures that looked like screaming faces, caught in mid-transformation. But by noon, the logic began to fray. He stopped to check his GPS. The screen was black. He pressed the power button, but the device remained cold. He swapped the battery for a fresh one, then another. Nothing. He pulled out his analog compass, a reliable piece of brass and steel. The needle didn't point north. It didn't even spin. It sat perfectly still, pointing directly toward a cluster of trees to his left. When Elias moved 10 paces to the right, the needle tracked the trees, following them like an eye following a predator. Magnetic ore in the soil, Elias muttered to himself. He needed the explanation. He needed the world to make sense. But the forest was tired of making sense. By 2 p.m., the light began to change. In the real world, the sun would be at its zenith. But here, the sky was a bruised, sickly purple. The canopy above was so dense that the leaves, dark and heavy as leather, seemed to weave together, forming a ceiling that groaned with every gust of wind. The sound wasn't the rustle of leaves. It was the sound of 1,000 dry throats trying to swallow. Elias decided to turn back. He wasn't a fool. He knew when a hike was turning into a survival situation. He turned 180 degrees and began to follow his own boot prints in the soft black muck. He walked for 30 minutes, then 40. He should have reached the salt line by now. Instead, he found himself in a clearing he didn't recognize. In the center of the clearing stood a single dead birch tree. It was white as a bleached bone, and its branches were hung with hundreds of small, rusted keys. Elias stopped, his heart thudding. He hadn't seen this tree on the way in. He checked his tracks. The boot prints he had been following didn't lead back to the trailhead. They led in a perfect, mocking circle right back to the birch tree. Except as he looked closer, he realized something that made the hair on his arms stand up. The boot prints weren't his. They were the same brand, the same size, but the tread was worn down in a way his weren't. And there were 3 sets of them, all walking in the same circle. The bag of teeth. The sun, or whatever provided the dim purple light, began to sink. The shadows in the Blackroot didn't behave like normal shadows. They didn't stretch. They crawled. They detached themselves from the base of the trees and drifted toward Elias like spilled ink. He reached for his camera bag, which he had set down for a moment to wipe the sweat from his brow. He went to grab the strap, but his hand froze. The bag was sitting at the base of the bone-white birch. But it wasn't the bag he had brought. His bag was a rugged, weatherproof nylon. This bag was made of something that looked like cured, translucent skin. He could see the shapes of the equipment inside, the long cylinders of his lenses, the boxy shape of his camera body. With trembling fingers, Elias unzipped the main compartment. The smell hit him first. It wasn't rot. It was the smell of a dentist's office, cloying, sterile, and metallic. The bag wasn't full of glass and electronics. It was packed to the brim with human teeth, thousands of them. Molars, incisors, wisdom teeth, some pristine and white, others blackened by decay. They were wet as if they had just been pulled, and as Elias stared in horror, the entire mass of teeth began to pulse. They moved in a rhythmic, undulating wave, a collective heartbeat of calcium and nerve endings. At the very top of the pile lay a single gold-crowned molar. Elias recognized it. It was his father's. His father had been dead for 10 years, buried in a closed casket 3 states away. "This isn't real," Elias whispered, his voice cracking. "This is a hallucination. Spores. I've inhaled some kind of neurotoxic fungus." "Is that what you need to believe, Elias?" The voice was a whisper, but it didn't come from behind him. It came from the bag. The teeth shifted, clicking against one another like 1,000 tiny castanets, and for a split second they formed the shape of a mouth. "You spend your life capturing the surface," the voice rattled. "But the Blackroot wants the roots. We want the things you keep behind your lips." Elias kicked the bag away. It didn't tumble like a bag of gear. It flopped like a dead weight. He turned and bolted into the dark, ignoring the branches that clawed at his face, ignoring the way the ground seemed to soften under his feet like a tongue. The unpredictable shift. He ran until his lungs were on fire, until the purple light faded into a total, suffocating blackness. He fumbled in his pocket for his high-lumen flashlight. He clicked it on. The beam of light cut through the dark, but it didn't reveal the forest. Elias was standing in a hallway. It was a hallway from a house he hadn't lived in since he was 6 years old. The wallpaper was peeling, a floral pattern of faded roses. The floor was carpeted in a shag rug that felt damp under his hiking boots. He turned the flashlight around. Behind him wasn't the path he had just run down. There was only a door, a heavy oak door with no handle. He looked up. Where the ceiling should have been, there were only the giant, intertwined roots of the Blackroot Forest, dripping with the thick black sap that fell like slow, heavy rain onto the carpet. Plip, plip, plip. Elias moved forward, his flashlight beam shaking. At the end of the hallway was a mirror. He approached it, hoping to see his own reflection, a familiar anchor in this nightmare. But when he stood before the glass, he saw nothing. The mirror didn't reflect the hallway. It didn't reflect the flashlight. It showed a vast, empty gray plain under a sky of swirling ash, and in the center of that plain sat a man. The man was sitting in a modern, ergonomic chair, his face illuminated by the pale blue glow of a smartphone. The man was scrolling. His thumb moved with mechanical regularity. Swipe, swipe, swipe. Elias looked closer. The man in the mirror was him, but it was a version of him that had been hollowed out. The eyes were there, but the Elias was gone. Behind the man, a towering figure made of shadows and silver wire stood, its long, needle-like fingers resting gently on his shoulders. The figure in the mirror looked up. Even though it had no face, Elias felt its gaze. It raised a finger to where its mouth should be. Shh. The mirror shattered. Elias was slammed back into the cold, wet dirt of the forest. He was back in the clearing with the birch tree. But the tree was different now. The keys were gone. In their place, hanging from the branches by thin silken threads, were hundreds of shimmering golden orbs. And as Elias watched, one of the orbs began to dim. It flickered like a dying light bulb and went dark. Somewhere in the woods, a man let out a long, final sigh. Elias realized then that the keys hadn't been to doors. They had been to people, and he had just handed over his own. End of Chapter 1.